It is October 1812. The cold season has just begun in central India. The Grand Trunk Road stretches south from Etawah through scrubland and dry riverbed, and the dust has not settled since morning. A merchant caravan, maybe 12 men, has stopped at a serai outside the village of Sindhus. The walls of the inn are sun-baked mud. The courtyard smells of wood smoke and cattle dung and the faintly sweet rot of hay that has been rained on and dried too many times. The men are tired. They have walked 16 miles today, which is the distance between serais, which is the distance a man on foot can cover before the light fails. They have tethered their bullocks. They have cooked dal over a low fire and eaten it with flatbread torn by hand. Somewhere outside the walls, a golden jackal begins to howl, then another, then a third. It sounds like laughter from a long way off. And sometime in the last hour, 3 strangers joined the group. They say they are heading south too. They are friendly. They know the road. No one in the caravan will arrive where they are going. This is the story of the Thugee. Not the version you know from the movies, the real one, which is, in almost every way, stranger. If you have heard the word Thugee before, you probably heard it in one of 2 places. The first is Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, Steven Spielberg's 1984 film, where a revived Thugee cult practices child slavery, black magic, and human sacrifice in a hidden underground temple. That film was banned in India. It also helped create the PG-13 rating. The second place you might have encountered it is in the word itself, thug. It comes from the Hindi thug, which comes from the Sanskrit staga. It means a deceiver, a cheat. The word traveled from medieval Indian court records to Victorian penny press headlines to Tupac Shakur's chest tattoo to the evening news, where it became something else entirely. But that is a story for later in the hour. The story I want to tell today sits between 2 versions of the Thugee that have dominated for almost 200 years. In one version, the thugs were a secret religious cult devoted to the goddess Kali, responsible for strangling 2 million people across 5 centuries. In the other version, they never existed at all, and the whole thing was invented by the British to justify colonial expansion. The truth, as it usually does, lives in the difficult space between those poles. There were real people strangling real travelers on real roads. That is documented. The question is what we do with everything that was built on top of that fact. Because what the British Empire built on top of it was a machine. A legal, bureaucratic propaganda machine that would eventually criminalize 13 million people at birth. And the gears of that machine are still turning. I am A.M. Blackmere. This is the Blackmere Podcast. And today, we are going to the Grand Trunk Road. To understand the Thugee, you have to understand the road. Not the idea of a road, the physical thing, the dust, the distance, the fact that in early 19th century India, walking 16 miles in a day was an achievement. And at the end of those 16 miles, the only thing between you and the dark was a mud-walled compound run by a man you had never met. The Grand Trunk Road was one of Asia's oldest and longest routes. It ran from Bengal to Afghanistan. Parts of it were ancient. Parts of it were well-maintained. Much of it, by the early 1800s, was not. The Mughal Empire, which had once secured these roads with military garrisons and a functioning postal system, had been collapsing for a century. The emperor still sat in Delhi, but his authority did not extend much past the walls. Local powers filled the vacuum. Some were stable, many were not, and the roads became dangerous. The travelers on these roads were not tourists. They were merchants carrying trade goods, bankers' agents carrying coins and promissory notes, soldiers between postings, pilgrims, families. They moved in groups because moving alone was suicide. They carried what they owned, and they slept in serays. A serai was a walled enclosure, usually square, with a single gate that could be barred at night. Rooms arranged around a central courtyard. Charpoys, the simple rope beds. Animals tethered in the yard. The sound at night was a layered thing. Camels grunting, horses shifting, the low conversation of men around cook fires. And beyond the walls, the calls of Indian scops owls, a soft, questioning whook repeated at irregular intervals, and the howl of jackals that seemed to come from every direction at once. The serays were spaced roughly every 8 kos apart, about 16 miles, which meant your day's journey was defined by the distance between walls. And the men who ran those serays were not always honest. Some of them fed information to the people waiting on the road. They would note who was carrying money, who was traveling light, who had guards and who did not. The serai was supposed to be the safe place. Sometimes it was the place where you were marked. The people who waited on the road worked in groups, 10 to 50 men, sometimes more. They did not look like bandits. That was the point. They looked like fellow travelers. They would approach a caravan, ask to walk together for safety, share food, share conversation. They might travel alongside you for days, building trust, learning who you were, what you carried, where you were going, and who would miss you when you did not arrive. And then, at a signal, at a place they had scouted in advance, they would kill everyone. Not rob and release, kill. Because witnesses were a liability. The bodies were buried in shallow graves dug with a small pickaxe, the kudali, which they carried wrapped in cloth. The graves were shallow because the work had to be fast, and the road moved on. The earliest known reference to organized Thugee comes from a medieval Persian chronicle called the Tariq-e-Firuz Shahi, written around 1356 by a court historian named Ziauddin Bahrani. Bahrani records that Sultan Jalaluddin Khalji, who ruled the Delhi Sultanate around 1290, arrested roughly 1,000 Thugs in the Delhi region. He did not execute them. He loaded them onto boats and deposited them in Bengal. Now, the modern scholar Kim Wagner, whose 2007 book Thugee is the definitive academic treatment of the subject, points out something important about that passage. Bahrani was writing 60 years after the events he described. The word thug in the 13th century probably just meant swindler or common thief, not the specific strangulation and burial practice the British would later define as Thugee. And the Sultan's decision to deport rather than execute suggests he did not consider these men a uniquely dangerous religious fraternity. He considered them a nuisance. But that passage would later be cited by the British as proof of an ancient and continuous Thugee cult stretching back to the 1200s. The distance between what Bahrani actually wrote and what was made of it is a theme we will return to. The first European to describe something that looks like Thugee was a Frenchman named Jean de Thébénot, traveling through India in 1665. He warned future travelers not to let strangers approach them on the road. He described robbers who used, in his words, a certain slip with a running noose which they can cast with so much sleight about a man's neck when they are within reach of him that they never fail. He also described a tactic where a beautiful woman, weeping and disheveled, would be sent out as a decoy. Thébénot did not call these men thugs. He did not mention religion. He did not mention Kali. He called them robbers. The most cunning robbers in the world, he said, but robbers. A generation later, in 1698, an Englishman named John Fryer witnessed the execution of highway robbers near Surat. He described an old man and his 2 sons being hanged. The old man was defiant. His youngest son, not yet 14 years old, boasted that he had already killed 15 men. friar described them going to the gallows cheerfully, smoking tobacco, eating sweets offered by onlookers, as jolly as if going to a wedding. That image, the cheerful walk to the scaffold, it tells you something about the world these men lived in. A world where this work was a profession, not a deviation. A world where a boy of 14 could claim 15 kills and consider it a point of pride. That is not the behavior of a secret cult. That is the behavior of a community. And here is where the economics matter. Kim Wagner argues, persuasively, that the emergence of Thugee was linked to the disruption of the military labor market. As the Mughal Empire fragmented and the East India Company expanded, native armies were disbanded. Thousands of trained soldiers, men who knew no other work, found themselves unemployed. Some turned to banditry. Local landlords, the zamindars, sometimes financed these expeditions in exchange for a share of the loot. It was investment, not ideology. One of the most striking documents in the entire Thugee archive is a tax list from 1797, recovered from the village of Sindaus in Gwalior state. It lists 318 households whose heads paid a regular thug tax to the Maratha government. 318 families paying tax on their occupation to the state. The Maratha authorities were not suppressing Thugee, they were taxing it. They were treating it as a revenue source, the way you tax any trade. And the work was seasonal, October to March, the cool, dry months when travel was possible and the agricultural calendar left men idle. Many of the people involved in Thugee were farmers the rest of the year. They supplemented their income during the off-season the way a fisherman might take construction work in winter. This is an uncomfortable picture. It is easier to think of these men as monsters, as cultists, as something alien. But the evidence points to something more ordinary and, in its own way, more disturbing. A predatory economy, embedded in local power structures, sustained by the same collapse of central authority that made the roads dangerous in the first place. The violence was real. The bodies were real. The grief of the families who waited for travelers who never arrived was real. But the religious mystique, the grand unified theory of an ancient pan-Indian murder cult, that would come later. And it would come from a very specific source. In 1816, a British doctor named Richard Sherwood published the first systematic European account of highway stranglers. He called them fansigars, from fancy meaning noose. He documented their methods, the cloth garrote, the murder before robbery principle, the careful burial of bodies. He was the first European to report a religious dimension, a tutelary deity he named Bhawani. He described omens, a consecrated pickaxe, rules about who could and could not be killed. Sherwood got many things right. He also got things wrong. He thought the phenomenon was regional. He thought certain rules of exclusion, that women and certain castes were spared, were inviolable. Later evidence would contradict both claims. But his article did something more consequential than document a criminal network. It framed these men not as ordinary bandits, but as a unique and extraordinarily dangerous fraternity, a breed apart, a special category requiring a special response. That framing would matter enormously, because 13 years later, a man would read Sherwood's work and see in it an opportunity. But first, one more early encounter, because it tells you something about the gap between what the British saw and what they chose to believe. In October 1812, a British officer named Nathaniel Halhed was dispatched to the village of Sindaus to introduce company law and order. The area was known for Thugee. Rajput landlords employed thug gangs as local enforcers. Halhed's expedition scattered these groups into neighboring Maratha territory, but it cost a British officer his life, and the village of Murnai was razed. And here is the remarkable part. In his report that December, Halhed pushed back against the emerging narrative. He wrote that these men were no more than a species of robber whose policy consists in murdering the person they rob. He dismissed the idea of a secret society, comparing the emerging hysteria to conspiracy theories about the Illuminati. He said they can seldom be convicted from want of evidence to corroborate their confessions, which they, in general, will make before a magistrate, because they themselves attach no idea of dishonor to this their profession. No idea of dishonor. That phrase again. Men who considered this work a trade, not a sin. Halhed saw that clearly in 1812. It would take the rest of the British establishment another 2 decades to arrive at a very different conclusion. William Henry Sleeman was born in 1788 in Cornwall, the younger son of minor gentry. In Regency England, younger sons inherited very little. The paths available were the military, the clergy, or the colonial service. Sleeman chose India. He arrived in 1809, joined the Bengal Army, and fought in the Anglo-Nepalese War, where jungle fever killed more of his regiment than the enemy did. By 1820, he had pivoted from the military to civil administration, and by 1829, his career had stalled. He was a junior political agent in central India, competent but unremarkable. Then something happened. Another officer, Captain Borthwick, made a series of high-profile arrests of men identified as thugs. The press noticed, the administration noticed, and Sleeman noticed too. The historian Mike Dash, in his book Thug, suggests that Sleeman's sudden, intense interest in the Thugee problem was not purely humanitarian. It was also strategic. Here was a cause that could make a name for a man who had been passed over. This does not mean Sleeman was a cynic. He appears to have been genuinely horrified by what he uncovered. But horror and ambition are not mutually exclusive. They rarely are in the men who build empires. Sleeman's great advantage was that he spoke fluent Urdu and Persian. This was rare among British officers. It meant he could interrogate directly without an interpreter, and it meant he could hear the texture of what his subjects told him. He used this ability to build something unprecedented, the approver system. An approver was a captured thug who agreed to cooperate. In exchange for a pardon, he would name other thugs, testify against them in court, and provide detailed confessions about every expedition he had ever participated in. The confession would be transcribed by a British scribe. The questions came from Sleeman. The answers were filtered through the relationship between a prisoner and the man who held his life in his hands. The system was devastatingly effective. Between 1826 and 1835, 1,562 accused thugs were tried. 382 were sentenced to death. 909 were transported. 77 received life imprisonment. The conviction rate approached 98.9%. That number should stop you. A 98.9% conviction rate. In any legal system, at any point in history, a number like that does not indicate justice functioning well. It indicates justice functioning as a rubber stamp. For comparison, the modern United States, which has one of the highest conviction rates in the developed world, sits around 90%. British courts in the 1830s were considerably lower. The Thugee trials were not trials in any meaningful sense. They were ceremonies of confirmation, and the legal framework made this possible. The Thugee and Dacoity Suppression Acts allowed conviction based on association rather than individual acts. The testimony of a single approver, a man whose freedom depended on providing names, could send another man to the gallows. The accused had no right to counsel as we understand it. The proceedings were conducted in English, a language many of the accused did not speak. The judge was often the same official who had overseen the investigation. The most important approver was a man named Faringaya. Born around 1800, Brahmin, from the village of Sindos,
the same village that appeared on that 1797 tax list. His grandfather and uncle are on that list. Feringhea himself claimed to be a seventh-generation thug. He became a jemadar, a gang leader. In the cold season of 1828 to 1829, his gang strangled 77 men and 3 women. He was captured in November 1830. And here is how Sleeman secured his cooperation. When Feringhea initially evaded capture, Sleeman's militiamen arrested the occupants of his house, his mother, his wife, his child. They were held until Feringhea surrendered. That is not intelligence gathering. That is hostage-taking. Feringhea cooperated. He became Sleeman's most valuable source, identifying 283 thugs after a sweep through villages near Jhansi. He spent the rest of his life confined to a settlement in Jabalpur, where pardoned thugs and their families were housed, monitored, and put to work weaving cloth. Occasionally, Western tourists would visit, and the former thugs would be paraded out and made to reenact their methods. A display, an exhibit. Feringhea's nephew, Jarhu, was executed despite not being a thug. The specific circumstances of his trial, if there was one, are not well documented. This is the approver system in its full shape. Cooperation bought with threats against family. Testimony shaped by the questions of the man holding the pen. And the certainty that if you stopped being useful, the protection stopped too. And then there is the question of Kali. The colonial narrative held that the thugs worshipped Kali, the Hindu goddess of destruction, and that their strangulations were ritual sacrifices performed in her name. This version of events was central to Sleeman's writings and became the defining feature of Thugee in the Western imagination. It was also, by the assessment of multiple modern scholars, significantly distorted. I want to be precise about this because the theological stakes are real and they matter to living people. Kali is one of the most important deities in Hinduism. In the Devi Mahatmya, a foundational 6th century text, she emerges as a fierce manifestation of the goddess Durga, born from Durga's forehead to defeat the demon Raktabija. She is terrifying in appearance. Dark skin, a garland of heads, a lolling tongue. She drinks the demon's blood before it can touch the ground and spawn more demons. She is the power that restores cosmic order when nothing else can. She is, for millions of devotees across India and Bengal in particular, a loving and protective mother. The Kali Dak Temple in Kolkata is one of the most sacred pilgrimage sites in the Hindu world. Kali Puja is celebrated with devotional songs and community gatherings during Diwali. There is no documented connection between the priests of the Kali Ghat temple and any Thugee activity. None. Even Feringhea, the most famous approver, explicitly denied direct involvement of Kali temple priests. This matters because the colonial narrative did not merely misunderstand Kali, it weaponized her. It took a complex theological figure, a goddess who represents the fierce compassion necessary to destroy evil, and turned her into a justification for foreign intervention in Indian religious life. Contemporary Hindu scholars and practitioners have rejected and condemned this association. The distortion has been durable. It persists in popular culture, in Wikipedia articles, in the scripts of Hollywood blockbusters. And it is wrong. The scholar Cynthia Ann Humes, in her essay Wrestling with Kali, analyzed the colonial archives and found that Kali references in approver testimony appeared mostly in response to Sleeman's leading questions. Sleeman came to the interrogations with a theory. He asked questions that confirmed it. The thugs, under duress and seeking leniency, provided answers they believed their interrogator wanted to hear. This is not conspiracy. It is the ordinary mechanics of coerced testimony. Feringhea himself, when his statements are analyzed critically, does not support the idea of dedicated Kali temples or priests specifically for Thugee rituals in the way Sleeman portrayed it. That is from a 2018 scholarly article by Parveen and Rath examining the colonial positioning of Kali within the Thugee narrative. This does not mean the thugs had no rituals. They did. The most documented is the Gur ceremony. Gur is raw jaggery, an unrefined sugar made from boiled sugarcane juice. Dark brown, smoky, intensely sweet. After a killing, the Gur was consecrated to Bhavani, their name for the protective aspect of the goddess, and consumed in silence by the group. It was a communion, a bonding rite. A captured thug described it this way: "Let anyone once taste of that gore, and he will be a thug, though he know all the trades and have all the wealth in the world. It changes our very nature." That is the testimony of a man describing something he experienced as sacred. And it is also the testimony of a man whose freedom depended on telling a British officer what that officer needed to hear. Both things are true at once. That is what makes this history difficult. Not because the answers are hidden, but because the answers are layered, and every layer was put there by a hand with its own interests. One detail that complicates the simple Kali cult narrative even further: the thugs were not exclusively Hindu. Significant numbers of Muslims participated in Thugee networks. Colonial records indicate that some Muslim thugs revered Bhavani but identified her with Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet Muhammad. This allowed them to reconcile their participation with Islamic monotheism. This syncretism, this pragmatic blending of belief systems to accommodate a shared criminal enterprise, does not appear in any mainstream Islamic or Sufi sources outside the Thugee context. It was local, it was improvised, and it suggests that the religious dimension of Thugee was less a unified theology than a patchwork of beliefs shaped by the needs of the men who held them. The thugs also had their own secret language, called Ramasi. It was not a full language with its own grammar, but a coded vocabulary layered on top of Hindustani. Words for their operations. Banij meant merchandise, which was their term for a victim, a traveler worth killing. Bail was the place chosen for burial. Bertoti was the office of strangler, a rank you did not attain until you had been on many expeditions. And the signal to kill, the phrase spoken aloud in a crowd that meant now, "I ho tagiri chulo," if you are come, pray descend. A language for the work, a vocabulary calibrated to hide in plain sight. That is not the behavior of religious fanatics. That is the infrastructure of a profession. By 1835, Sleeman was appointed General Superintendent for the suppression of Thugee. The Thugee and Dacoity Suppression Acts of 1836 to 1848 gave the campaign its legal teeth. These acts allowed individuals to be convicted based on their alleged affiliation with a criminal group, rather than on evidence of a specific crime they had committed. You could be convicted of being a thug, not of killing anyone, of being the kind of person who kills. In 1830, Sleeman published an anonymous letter in the Calcutta Literary Gazette describing the execution of 11 thugs. The letter was designed to shock. It worked. The British public, the colonial administration, and eventually Queen Victoria herself became fascinated by the Thugee menace. The novelist Philip Meadows Taylor published Confessions of a Thug in 1839, a sensationalized fiction that became a bestseller. Victoria requested to see the proofs before publication. Jules Verne borrowed the character of Feringhea for Around the World in 80 Days. The real Feringhea was still alive in Jabalpur, weaving cloth. He died there in late 1855, having spent the last 25 years of his life as a display piece in the Empire's trophy case. Sleeman himself was appointed British resident at Lucknow in 1849. His tour of the Kingdom of Oudh produced a report so damning of local governance that it was used to justify the annexation of the entire kingdom in 1856. And here is the final irony of Sleeman's career. He opposed the annexation. He believed reform was possible under native rule. He called annexation unjust and illegal. The empire used his words and ignored his conclusions. He died aboard a ship off the coast of Ceylon in February 1856, 4 days after being knighted. He was buried at sea. The man who built the machine did not get to choose what the machine was used for. That, too, is a pattern. In 1871, the British Parliament passed the Criminal Tribes Act. The logic was direct. If Thugee was hereditary, if it ran in families and castes, then the solution was to identify those families and those castes and put them under permanent surveillance. The act did not target individuals who had committed crimes. It targeted communities. Members of designated criminal tribes were subject to compulsory registration. They were issued passes that restricted their movement. They were required to report weekly to local police stations. Their children were taken to reformatory settlements, which were labor camps with a more palatable name. By 1908, these settlements required hard labor and compulsory fingerprinting. The evidentiary basis for designating a community as criminal was colonial prejudice dressed in the language of law. T.V. Stevens, a key advocate for the 1871 Act, wrote of tribes whose ancestors were criminal from time immemorial, who are themselves destined by the usage of caste to commit crime, and whose descendants will be offenders against law until the whole tribe is exterminated or accounted for. By the time India gained independence in 1947, the Criminal Tribes Act applied to approximately 13 million people across 127 communities. 13 million people criminalized at birth, not for what they had done, for who they were. The act was repealed in August 1949, 2 years after independence. But in 1952, the Habitual Offenders Act was passed, and it re-stigmatized many of the same communities under new language. In 2007, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination recommended that India repeal the Habitual Offenders Act, calling it a continuation of colonial injustice. The recommendation has not been fully implemented. Today, approximately 110 million people in India belong to what are called denotified tribes. In 2025, Madhya Pradesh authorities sought to increase surveillance on these communities, reviving colonial-era practices. Journalists described them as citizens without citizenship. Community members told reporters, "Despite being denotified, we are labeled as criminals." The road from a 1797 tax list in Sindus to a 2025 surveillance order in Madhya Pradesh is a straight line. It passes through Sleeman's interrogation rooms, through the approver settlements in Jabalpur, through the Criminal Tribes Act, through the Habitual Offenders Act. At every point along that road, someone drew a circle around a group of people and said, "These are not like us. These are born to this." And at every point, the circle was drawn by the hand holding the pen. And the word itself traveled. Thug. Thug. It left the court records of the Delhi Sultanate and entered the Victorian penny press. It crossed the Atlantic. In 1993, Tupac Shakur tattooed Thug Life across his stomach and redefined it as an acronym. The hate you give little infants fucks everybody. A statement about systemic violence turned inward. A reclamation, and then the word kept moving. By the 2010s, linguists and journalists were documenting its use as a racial code word in American media, a way of criminalizing Black Americans without saying the quiet part aloud. A word that began as Sanskrit for deceiver now functions in certain mouths as a way of saying these people are born to this. The circle, drawn again, by a different hand, on a different road, but the same geometry. I want to go back to the Sarai. October 1812. The courtyard, the dying fire, the jackals outside the walls. The three strangers who joined the caravan are still there. They are still friendly. They still know the road. And they are, most likely, men whose grandfathers did this same work, whose names might appear on a tax list their local government maintained, whose seasonal rhythm moved between planting rice and walking the Grand Trunk Road with a cloth folded in their waistband. They are not servants of a dark goddess. They are not members of a secret cult that stretches back to the mists of time. They are men in a collapsing economy, on a road the state can no longer protect, doing work that the local landlord financed and the local government taxed. And they are about to do something terrible. Both of those things are true. The human context and the human cost. The reason and the result. And the refusal to hold both at once. The insistence on choosing the version that makes the best story is what allowed an empire to turn a criminal network into a mythology, and a mythology into a legal weapon that is still being used against living people today on roads not so different from this one. The Grand Trunk Road still exists. It runs through Pakistan and India. Trucks use it now instead of bullock carts. The serai are mostly gone. But in central India, in the villages where the 1797 tax list was written, there are families who know what their great-great-grandparents were called, and what that name still costs them. I am A.M. Blackmere. Thank you for listening.